The camera lens is the primary tool of the photographer. Consider it as the photographer's paintbrush. And like in the entire series, I will compare it to other common optical systems. The binocular, of course, is a double telescope allowing a very natural view. It's fully handheld, portable, ready to go out of the box, doesn't need anything else to be useful. The camera lens is a part of a system. In and of itself, it's useless. There's not much you can do with it. You need to have the other part of the system, which is the camera. The lens, of course, is the primary component of the system. The camera is just a closed box with a dark room that would protect the medium, meaning the sensor in these days, or the film. And compared to a riflescope, professionally known as a gun-sight telescope, it has some
The camera
similarities.
lens is the
scope
primary
only
tool
an accessory
of
to
the
a closed
photographer.
system, which consists
Consider
of
it as
firearm,
the
the
photographer's
shooter,
paintbrush. And
the ammunition.
like in the entire series, I
Astronomical
will compare it
telescope is
to
made to look
other common optical systems
exclusively
at the night sky,
stars,
planets, deep sky object,
and
very natural view.
Of course,
It's fully handheld
telescopes
of
many
ready to
different
go out of the box. Doesn't need anything else to be
useful.
useful. The camera lens is a part of the system. In and of itself, it's useless. There's not much you can do with it. Subject-centric. You need to have the other part of the system, which is the camera. Anything. The lens, of course, is and finally the spotting scope, which can be regarded as a hybrid between an astronomy telescope and a binocular, so a smaller, more portable sensor than an astronomy telescope, of course, and less powerful and less compared to a specific rifle deep sky or to the night sky, a gun-sight telescope. But on the other hand, it's fairly portable, relatively scope is only an accessory to a closed system, which consists of some distances, but not as much as a binocular. The ammunition provides an astronomical telescope is made to look usually much more exclusively like at the night sky, a stars, planets, deep sky object. So here it is. There are, of course, the rest of the telescope family members, many different technologies, if you will. At least the big challenge in photography different technologies. So that's why conceptually it's different than all of these optics, because all these optics are happening in real time. So you use a spotting scope to look and view anything. And finally, the spotting scope, which can be regarded as a hybrid between an astronomy telescope and a binocular. So it's smaller, more portable than an astronomy telescope, of course, also less powerful and less specific to the deep sky or to the night sky. But on the other hand, it's fairly portable, relatively lightweight, that you can take it on foot some distances, but not as much as a binocular. But in contrast, it provides bigger objectives and usually much more magnification than a typical or normal binocular. So here it is as compared to the rest of the family members, if you will. The big challenge in photography is conceptually it's different than all of these optics, because all of these optics are happening in real time. So you use a spotting scope to look at some wildlife or forest or whatever the case may be. You need to be there in the moment that it's being used then and there, and same thing with binoculars, riflescopes, and the like. In photography, the whole idea of the photography is to capture a single time and place in the moment and share it later on. So you can take a photograph and then you can share it online or put it in an exhibition and so on and so forth. However, it is important to remember that the photograph itself is being taken in the moment. So the lens itself, from that perspective, is a little bit more similar to the binocular and these instruments, because when you're snapping the photo itself, even though the primary use would happen at a later time and in most cases in a different place, also the actual framing or capturing the photograph itself happens in real time. Care of your lens, very important. Only ever use the camera with a strap around your neck,
also
because
large events
using the camera even for short periods of times or short distances without a strap
to keep up with the action
is just waiting for an accident to happen. Same thing whenever you handle the lens, eliminate or at least minimize as much as possible all the eventualities of falling. So if you have to use it outdoors and you want to change lenses, make sure that you do it over a soft surface. Make sure that you have a protective lens in here so you can use neutral filters. I'm going to come back and mention that a little bit later, but there are filters that do not alter the appearance of the photograph, and you can leave it permanently screwed in
the back of the lens should always be covered, either
the filter thread
to the camera or covered like
so
this.
Very careful. That's the number one. Drops and bangs, same thing in very high-paced
but anyway, always
fast-paced
always keep it
scenarios of photography. Very often wedding photographers, also large events like ball games and things of that nature, when photographers have to run from one place to another to keep up with the action, they tend to bang the lens, especially in doorways, but guardrails, any kind of hard objects. And it can even happen in outdoors if you're climbing a mountain or hiking and there are some solid obstacles like trees or boulders. You have to be careful not to bang the lens in there, because the lenses, as good as they are, but they are very delicate optical instruments. And of course, for cleaning, keep any kind of abrasive and solid particulate off of the surface of the lens. The back of the lens should always be covered, either attached to the camera or covered like this. As you can see, this is a plastic cover, and I will demonstrate a couple other things later. But anyway, always keep it as protected as necessary. And of course, when they're not being used, keep all the lens caps and lens covers on the lens. And we will talk about weatherproofing, but in general terms, camera lenses are much less waterproof and weatherproof than their outdoor sport optic counterparts. So modern binoculars can even be submerged. Again, it's not recommended to do that, but you can drop them in water. If you drop a lens in the water, there's a good chance that it's going to be the last thing you do.
If we're talking
although
about
sometimes they could be
even the smallest sensors
salvaged.
Typically
so what is the camera
nature.
lens? The camera lens, of course, and I forgot to mention, shame on me, that the primary difference between the camera lens and its sporting good counterparts is that it has the challenge of forming an image on a flat and very large inorganic surface. So when you pick up a binocular, you're forming an image on the eye, and the pupil of the eye is tiny, and the internal organism that is light perceptive inside of the eye is also extremely small, so about the size of the head of a match. For those of you who remember
the mechanical adjustment system.
Not so with the camera lens. The camera lens projects a gigantic image, hundreds of times bigger than the light receptive, light sensitive area of the eye. If we're talking about full frame, even the smallest sensors that are typically in smartphones and devices of that nature, the smallest ones are about as big as the human receptive area, human eyes receptive area. But a normal camera lens like this for a full frame is hundreds of times bigger than that. So it's a huge challenge to recreate a three-dimensional scene on a two-dimensional surface, and that is the primary, at least one of the primary obstacles or challenges that any camera lens faces. And of course, this is a principal component in the photographic system. It must be mounted on a camera to be useful. And the mechanical adjustment system, typically that will be the focus, and the aperture has to be reliable, so it has to work, and it has to be precise. So if it says f2, it has to be 2, 2.8 it has to be 2. And of course, that is even more relevant with cinema lenses. We'll get to that in a little bit.
term from the
And
days of
of
film,
course,
with a
the
film
camera
didn't
lens
have the
has to
capability
be compatible
of taking
with
movies,
the
but
camera.
modern digital cameras, they take movies, so it has nothing to do with that.
And that
It's
means
just that
on
lenses
more
made
than
for
one
the
level.
cinema
So of course, if
industry
you use the same
are
system
constructed
within the
in a
same
special way,
brand,
so there
you
are
are covered
special
because
or
it's
specific
already
requirements for the cinema
assumed or
industry that a
manufactured
normal
from the get-go to go
individual
together. But that's not
photographer,
always
even
the case. In other words,
even a
sometimes you want to
professional
use components
photographer
that
does
haven't
not necessarily need.
conceived
And what are these? Number
initially
one,
to
they are
work together
external
or necessarily
controls.
to work together.
So the lens
The
has
classification
to be built in a way
of camera
that
lenses
a,
is a
it
little bit
allows for an
tricky
external
because
focus
at the end of
mechanism.
the day,
Typically,
a
there will
camera
be
lens
someone
is a
with a
camera
camera,
lens is a
and
camera
they will
lens. It
control the
creates
focus from
an
onboard,
image
which is
for
not the
photography.
same thing as autofocus. It's
But
manual
of course,
focus,
things
but
are not
remotely.
that simple. We normally talk
Same
about
thing with the
cinema
aperture.
lenses
In some camera
versus
lenses, the
still
aperture
lenses.
is smooth.
So
It
first
doesn't
of all,
go in
still is a borrowed or
particle
leftover term
or
from the days of
tactile
film
increments
when
like this
with a
one,
film camera didn't have
but
the
it's like
capability
one smooth motion,
of
and you
taking
have to be
movies.
very
But
precise
modern digital
and
cameras,
careful
they take movies, so it
on how
has
that
nothing
works.
to do
And
with that. It's just that
sometimes there could also be
lenses
an
made for the
external
cinema
mechanism
industry
controlling that. So
are
that's number
constructed
one. Number
in a
two,
special way. So there are
cinema lenses
special
have to be
or
very,
specific
very consistent
requirements
from
for the
one
cinema
another.
industry that a normal
In a movie,
individual
a
photographer, even
movie or even a
a
certain
professional
scene
photographer,
can
does
be
not
filmed from
necessarily
different
need.
angles.
And what are these?
Those cameras
Number
have to be
one,
very,
they
very
are
consistent
external
as,
controls.
as
So
pertaining
the
to the
lens
rendering, so
has
that
to
the
be
image
built
should be the
in a
same.
way
So the
that
skin tones, the colors,
it allows
all
for
of
an
those
external
things
focus
should
mechanism.
be
So typically there will be
very,
someone with a
very
camera
streamlined
and they will control the focus from
homogenized
on
almost.
board,
Well,
which is
almost
not the same
homogenized.
thing as
You want
autofocus.
them
It's
to be the
manual
same. So if they set
focus, but remotely.
the
Same
exposure
thing with the
value
aperture.
of
In
that
some camera lenses, the
that
aperture
lens,
is
it should be
smooth. It
consistent
doesn't
across
go in
multiple lenses.
little
So there could be 2, 3,
audible
4 lenses
or tactile increments like this one,
the same scene.
but
And
it's like
today,
one smooth motion.
there are
And you have
even
to be very
modules that
precise
allow
and careful
communication. So
on how that works.
many lenses
And
have a special port.
sometimes there
for
could also be an external
exporting,
mechanism controlling
information from
that.
the
So
CPU,
that's
so
number
they're
one.
all
Number two,
electronics,
cinema lenses
and
have to be
digitized.
very, very
And
consistent
that goes into a
from one
module,
another.
and then the modules talk between them.
In a
They
movie,
coordinate
a certain movie or even a certain scene
the
can
mating or the
be
matching
filmed
of
from
the
different
lenses.
angles.
All the lenses
And
have to have
those
a certain,
cameras have to be
a
very, very
certain
consistent
aperture, a certain,
as pertaining to the rendering, so that the image should be the same.
Complete
the skin
light
tones, the
throughput.
colors, all of those things
So
should
exposure
be
value, it has
very,
to be
very
consistent
streamlined,
across those lenses.
homogenized.
And another
not
thing
only
that
homogenized,
when
you want them
lenses,
to be the same. So
they
if they
don't talk
set
about f-stops,
the
they talk about t-stops. So in other words,
exposure
in a
value
camera lens,
of that
instead
lens, it should be
just
consistent
measuring the
across
physical
multiple lenses. So there could be
aperture,
2,
the
3,
difference
4
in aperture,
lenses
and again, all of
filming
these terms will be
the same
explained in the
scene.
end.
And
They will
today
also take into
there are even
consideration the
modules that
actual
allow
optical
communication.
performance
So
or optical
many
capability
lenses have a
of
special
the
port
lens.
for
So they will, instead
exporting
of having
information
just a
from the
physical
CPU. So they're all
f-stop, they would say
electronic and
how much
digitized.
light that specific
And that
lens
goes into a
lens.
module, and then the modules
This is
talk between them,
getting
and
a
they
little
coordinate
too much mumbo
the
jumbo and too specific to the cinema industry. But
mating or the
point
matching
is that
of the lenses. So all the lenses have to have a certain
a
certain aperture or a certain
they just made for slightly different requirements,
complete
more exact,
light
more demanding
throughput. So
in principle,
so
you
exposure
could use
value,
a camera
it has to be
lens with
consistent
your
across those
$25
lenses.
Old,
And another thing that
Nikon camera,
when lenses,
whatever the case
they
is,
don't
of
talk
course,
about
in
f-stops, they talk about
practice, there will
t-stops. So
be
in other
some
words,
challenges and
in a
obstacles
camera lens,
in mounting it there
instead
and
of
making it work. But
just
again,
measuring the physical aperture, the difference in aperture, and again, all of these terms will be explained in the end. They will also take into consideration the actual optical performance or optical capability of that lens. So they will, instead of having here just a physical f-stop, they will say
cannot afford
how much light that specific
full
lens
professional
lets
cinema
through.
lenses
But this is
would
getting a little
good
bit
quality
too much mumbo jumbo and
made
too
for the
specific
for the
to
photo
the cinema
market
industry.
on
But case in
on
point
a film
is that
camera. We're
cinema
just using
lenses are
an
in
advanced,
principle
more
the
advanced
same
digital camera
as camera lenses.
to make
They just
movies.
made
But there
for
is some
higher and slightly
interchangeability. So,
different
for example, the Canon
requirements,
mount
more exact, more demanding
is sometimes
requirements.
utilized.
In principle,
So
you
can buy
could use a
sometimes
camera lens
cinema
with
lenses
your
Canon mounts,
$25
there is a
old
possibility
Nikon camera or whatever the case is. Of course, in practice, there will be some challenges and obstacles in mounting it there and making it work. But again,
camera lenses. But just so you know, in principle, a cinema lens you can and does do. In general,
but again, in principle, they are interchangeable.
Other classifications,
and indeed, recently there is a trend which is goes a little bit in the opposite way. But people who cannot afford full professional cinema lenses will use good quality lenses made for the still for the photo market on a film camera. We're just using a more advanced digital camera to make movies. And there is some interchangeability. So, for example, the Canon mount
is vary.
Is sometimes utilized on cinema lenses.
This can
you
go
can buy
on
sometimes
one system
with
of
Canon
camera.
mounts, and then there is a possibility
quite a good number
to interchange them within cameras.
So, but if I try to put this on a
again, when classifying lenses, this is the primary classification, and today, of course, the main focus will be on normal camera lenses. But just so you know, in principle, a cinema lens can and does do, in general terms, the same thing. So other classifications, of course, we will talk about prime and zoom lenses. So whether a lens has a fixed focal length or a variable focal length,
but anyway,
the same thing as
you can see,
let's just say binoculars or spotting scopes. Most binoculars have a fixed magnification, but most modern spotting scope have variable magnification. So it's exactly the same idea, almost. The same idea. The physical mounts of camera lenses vary. Okay, so this can go on one system of camera. Typically, this is brand specific, so there are quite a good number of different standards out on the market. But if I try to put this on a camera of a different system, i.e. a different brand, it's not going to work. There are adapters, but of course there are other concerns as well.
The medium, meaning the sensor.
Number one is the flange distance. So the flange distance,
this is the mirror.
There is a nasty fingerprint which has to go.
And then if
I'll show you, it might just be visible.
Where you can see,
but anyway, as you can see,
a little bit.
The silver little lips right here when I'm putting my finger in, and try avoiding. I'm doing something not nice here, but I don't have a pen right here to show you. So these teeth fit into this bayonet mount, and the bayonet mount of different brands differ. So they cannot just take a lens from a different brand or a different brand camera and use it with this lens. However, this might be possible with an adapter.
Is the distance
but the adapter will change the flange distance. So a super important distance is the distance from this last element.
Similar
here
to
now you
what
can see
you
the
would
fingerprint,
call
right where the sun shines.
The eye relief or the exegetical distance, more
so the distance between this
in a sport
element and the medium, meaning the sensor or the film.
Super important.
And I'll show you. I have an old camera here.
Whether
this is the mirror
created on,
and I will lock the mirror up.
The medium.
And then if there was
a very exacting
where you can see the shutter mechanism a little bit
off kilter.
There's not enough light in there. But if there were film in the camera, you would be able to see the film, and you can see those little metal bars. So the film would be right in front of that, and if you can see the tiny little mark
kind of a paint. So whenever adapting
right after the handle of the film advance, you can see that there's a circle that's crossed that shows the film plane. So anyway, the flange distance is the distance between this element and the film, the medium, the sensor. Very similar to what you would call the eye relief, the exit pupil distance more professionally in a sport optic like a binocular. So that is super important, and that determines on whether an image can be created.
Imagine a micro 4/3 camera, which is a camera with
on
a
the medium.
sensor.
And that's a very exacting dimension. So it has to be very precise. If it goes off kilter, then you may not be able to focus one of these lenses. Usually there will be a range, but very often you will not be able to,
let's just say, with an
to reach
adapter,
infinity focus, which is kind of a
it would be no problem.
kind of a pain. So whenever adapting lenses of different systems to a camera, this has to be taken into account. And the other thing that we need to account with is sensor or medium coverage. So there are different mediums. There is maybe the best known, or I don't know if today it's still the most common, but for many years the most common format was what we call today full frame, or used to be called 36 millimeter or 35 millimeter film,
on a big camera, on a medium format.
And there are sensors that are smaller or bigger than the dimension. So imagine a micro four thirds camera, which is a camera with a smaller sensor.
I could still take an image, and especially today,
kind of on the similar idea than a 110 film, for those who remember. So it's a smaller film than the 35 millimeter. And if I were to use one of these lenses on a micro four thirds camera, adapting it, let's just say with an adapter, then it would be no problem. Let's just say that we overcome the flange focal distance
and make it work with a flange focal distance.
That would not be a problem, and indeed the sensor or the camera would only use the central part of this lens, so the images might even come out with a better quality, because typically the quantity is better closer to the center. But what happens if we do the opposite? What happens if we put this lens instead of a micro four thirds camera on a big camera, on a medium format or a large format camera, right, an older camera? So the image circle might not cover the entire sensor or film. I could still take an image, and especially today in the digital age, we can crop the corners, but again, there isn't really almost any scenario where this would make sense or this would be practical. So these are the three things that need to be taken into consideration. So the single most important factor is the flange focal distance. Can we adapt cameras and lenses of different systems and make it work with this flange focal distance? Number two is the obstacle of the physical mating or the physical match between the lens and the camera system. And number three is again the sensor coverage, which in case that the lens is bigger than the sensor or
primary structure
film in question, that's okay. If it's smaller, we have to know that we're going to run into a problem, so we have to crop the image. And again, it's possible even with film. You could just take scissors and cut the film. But in reality, there's no practical or
from a relatively wide focal length of 28. Can you see
the physical structure of the lens?
28
consists mainly of the housing. So the housing is what holds everything together.
All the way out to 70. So
all right, and now you know why you always need to use this in the back, so that you don't all of a sudden take it off and embarrass yourself in front of everybody.
It goes down to 28.
Nasty finger, which I never ever did before. This is the first time.
Millimeter focal length.
It wasn't me. It was my girlfriend, the dog, 70. You name it. But anyway, it did happen. So it's shame on me, because it should have been covered. It shouldn't stay uncovered. And so this primary structure is the housing, and then close to here you have the aperture ring. This controls or regulates the aperture. This, in case of this lens, this is a zoom lens, so it goes from a relatively long focal length of 70 millimeters. From a relatively wide focal length of 28. Can you see the indicator there? It says 28. It's visible.
At 70, the same aperture.
Focus in here, and then it goes all the way out to 70. So the indicator is this little white line.
All of this would be explained. Right here in the focus.
Now you can see 70.
I'm sorry, this rubber
and it goes down to 28. So I can take photos from 28
to have a better
millimeter focal length all the way up to 70.
Grabbing this,
and you can see that the designation is on the lens, or if you look in front,
and this is a focus.
It says 3.5 to 4.5, and that is the maximum opening of the aperture. So the aperture goes from a maximum of f3.5 at the shortest focal length, so meaning a 28,
what we're focusing on,
without
back
touching the aperture, without
focus.
increasing it. Obviously, it's not possible to increase because it's on the highest
and
setting.
it's also
And again,
dependent
all of
to
this
some
is going to
degree
be explained for those
upon
of
the
you
aperture.
who
So
know
this
what
is
I'm
the
talking
basic
about.
construction of the lens,
And
of
at
course
70, the same aperture
bayonet mount
will only
I
be
already
4
showed
and a
you,
half,
and again,
which is
bayonet
small,
mount
bigger
is
number. But
today
again,
the most common system, but it's by far
all
not
of
the
this
only
would
one. There
be
used to be
explained.
screw
Right
system.
here in the focus,
And I also want to show
sorry,
you
this
something
rubber is
a
makeshift.
little
I shouldn't
funkier.
be
This
showing
camera
this, but again, I
is
put
from
it
the
there
late
to
50s,
have a
early
better
60s.
purchase. As
It's
you
still
can see where
functional. I can still
my
take
fingers are
photographs with it.
grabbing this,
And
there isn't a hell
this
lot of room
camera
to
was
turn this. And this
designed
is
and
a
engineered
focus.
before
And some fancier
this
lenses or
interchangeable
sold
lens
as fancy
system came
lenses
out.
have
So
a
it was
depth of
sold
field
sort of an
gauge
interchangeable
here.
system, but
And
in
I'll
reality
explain that
it's not.
also. But this
You
shows
can remove
you
this part,
the exact focus,
but this is
and
only
then
the front
beyond
element.
the focus, how much
So
in front
in here the
of
lens
what
is
we're
built
focusing
into
on,
the
and
camera,
how much in the
which means
back
that the shutter and
will
the
still
controls
be
are
in
also
focus.
on board the camera.
It's quite good to
And
know,
in an
and it's
ironic
also
twist of
dependent
fate,
to some
modern
degree
cameras,
upon the
especially
aperture.
now
So
with
this
the
is the
return
basic
to
construction of the
mirrorless
lens, and of
cameras,
course the bayonet mount
this
I already showed you. And again, bayonet mount
idea to
is
some
today the
degree
most
returns. So
common
in other words,
system, but it's
today
by
with
far not the
digital
only
cameras,
one.
it's
There
not
used
so
to
much
be
the
a
digital
screw
part, but
system.
the electronic
And
part.
I
Everything is
also want to
controlled
show you
on
something
board the
a
camera
little funkier.
and the lens. So
This
you have
camera
here the focus,
is from
which
the
is
late
an integral part
50s,
of the
early
camera,
60s.
again,
It's
because
still
this is a
functional. I can still
lens
take
and camera
photographs
combo. So
with
it's
it.
not obviously
And
not exactly the same thing.
this
And
camera
you can get
was
a replacement or a
designed and
different
engineered
lens, which
before
in this case, this is an
this interchangeable lens system
35
came out.
millimeter
So it was
lens
sold
element, and it
sort of an
replaces the front
interchangeable
element
system, but in
this
reality
camera.
it's
It
not.
comes in a funky little,
You can
very
remove
old style
this part,
backlit.
but this is only the front
People call
element.
it sometimes a bubble.
So in here the lens is built into the
Bubble
camera,
packaging.
which means
But
that the
anyway,
shutter and the
so
controls are
same
also
idea
on
goes on
board
with
the camera.
with a
And
bayonet
in an
mount, and
ironic
now
twist of
you've turned
fate,
this,
modern
which
cameras,
normally comes as a
especially
50
now
millimeter,
with the return
into
to
a 35
mirrorless
millimeter
camera,
system, and there is another lens that is
this
85, and another one
idea
that's really
to
big,
some
that's
degree
100,
returns. So in other words, today
and either
with digital
105
cameras,
or
it's not so much the
115.
digital
I don't
part,
remember.
but the
But
electronic
again,
part.
this system
Everything is
fell out
controlled from
of
on
favor,
board the camera,
and if you
and
see
not
something like
the
this,
lens.
know
So
that
you
this
have
is
here the
not
focus,
a
which is an
complete
integral part of the camera.
photography
Again,
lens.
because
It
this is
only
a
replaces the
lens
front
and camera
element, so
combo,
it's
so
kind
it's
of like
not
a
obviously not
workaround.
exactly the
It's
same
obviously
thing.
well engineered, and it's
And
not a
you
makeshift
can get a
improvised
replacement or a
system, but it's
different
by
lens,
far
which
not as
this, in this
versatile
case, this is a
as the
35 millimeter lens element,
system,
and it
which is
replaces the front
today
element
still the most
locking of this
commonly
camera.
used
Not
and
fully
the
locking, but
interchangeable lens
snapping
system.
old style. So as you can see
And I
now it is
mentioned
set on 2.
mirrorless cameras
People
because
call it
today they
2.8.
are becoming more
It's
and
not
more
easy to
popular,
move it. I need some effort.
even
And bubble
though
packaging. But
photography
anyway,
as
so
a
same idea goes on with a
industry
and
is
so
dying
on.
because
With a bayonet mount,
most
and now you've
smartphones
turned
most
this
lenses
go down
which
to
normally comes
as
as
a
a
50
millimeter,
mm, which is the smallest
into a
aperture.
35
Of course, you
millimeter
can
news
have
and
special.
scenarios
There's
and
another
this that go.
lens that is 85,
But anyway, manufacturers
and
figure
another
that
one
there's
that's
no,
really big.
no
That's
real need today to have a mirror
100
inside,
and
so they
either
make
105 or
mirrorless
115.
camera
I don't
where
remember.
the flange focal distance
But again,
is much
this
shorter,
system
and then,
fell out
course,
of favor. And if you see something like this, know that this is
system like
not a
that
complete
is,
photography
reduces a
lens. It
lot of
only
the weight
replaces
and the
the front
complexity
element, so it's kind of like a
the
workaround. It's obviously well engineered, and
older
it's not a
system. So,
makeshift improvised
again, we covered the structure,
system, but
of
it's
course, the
by
function,
far not as
the
versatile
focusing ring,
as
just
the
the focus of the image. We can go back to the concept of focus.
next system, which is
Normally,
today still the
focusing
most
ring
commonly used,
should be
and
smooth
the interchangeable
and
lens
have a
system.
little bit of resistance, very
And I
similar to the
mentioned
focusing
mirrorless
mechanism
cameras
in
because
a
today they
binocular.
are becoming
You
more
want
and
it to
more
be
popular.
smooth, but you also
Even
want
though
it to have
photography
some resistance.
as a
This
manufacturing
lens, I think,
industry
was
is
made
dying
in the late, in a
smartphones
70s.
are becoming
late
so good that they're replacing
early
most
70s.
photographic
And it's
needs
well
and
worn,
scenarios.
well used. I've used it for a long time.
But anyway, manufacturers
it's
figure
a
that there's
little bit
no
lighter or
real need
easier
today to have a
turn
mirror inside,
than
so
what
they
I
make
would
a
prefer, but it still
mirrorless
works well.
camera
So it's not so
where the
when
flange
I'm
focal
spinning it,
distance is much
it doesn't
shorter,
spin
and that,
on its
of
own, and
course,
there is no play. Maybe a tiny
system
little
like
bit.
that
You would
is
really really have to be super
reduces a
anal to
lot of the
detect
weight and the
any
complexity
kind of unwanted or unnecessary
of the older system.
movement
So
or slop.
again, we
in
covered the structure,
this
of course, the
system.
function,
And
the
similarly,
focusing
the
ring, and just
aperture
the
ring
focus of the
has
image.
to
We're
be
going to go back to
consistent
the
and has
concept
to
of
be
focus.
locking
Normally the focusing ring should be smooth and have a little bit of resistance, very similar to the focusing mechanism in a binocular. You want it to be smooth, but you also want it to have some resistance. This lens, I think, was made in the late, in the 70s, not late 70s, early 70s. And it's well worn, well used. I've used it for a long time. And it's a little bit lighter or easier to turn than what
only goes on to 16 because it's an older lens, but it's usually sufficient. And I mentioned the filter threads, which are a standardized size. They're not all the same for all lenses, but there is a set number of sizes. So, and all manufacturers adhere by that. So a 52 millimeter filter thread would accept all 52 millimeter filters, and there is a handful of different sizes, but it's not infinite. It's not like every lens has a different size. It of course pertains to the physical size of the lens. There are a lot of filters for a lot of purposes. Right now is not really the time to talk about it, but the most common ones are UV filters, ultraviolet, polarizing filters that regulate glare. If you want to photograph a lake or some body of water in sunlight and you want to reduce the glare, examples like that. UV filter protects a little bit the lens itself, the camera itself, the film in the day of the films. Maybe it has some influence on the sensor. Typically, you don't see it on the image. Sometimes there is UV pollution, so depending on the context, it can remove that kind of washed out sensation of a certain scene. And then you have neutral density. That's a filter that makes the image darker. So the neutral densities are sold typically in stops, like such as how much they darken the scene. 1 stop, 2 stop, 3 stops, and so on. And that is for the eventuality that you want to leave the aperture open for a longer time, typically to blur motion, like from a waterfall. So that's the classic example. But of course there could be other scenarios, and I think we touched upon the digital ports for cine lenses. Again, weatherproofing. These are obviously not weatherproof at all, so a couple minutes in the rain maximum. Modern lenses are better waterproof, so if you go to an area with water, something splashing, a fountain or a waterfall or things of that nature, they are pretty well protected. But if you want to photograph lightnings, for example, and you want to stand out for hours and hours in the rain, it's not recommended. And definitely leave the lens on the camera. Don't remove it and use an umbrella or some sort of cover. Definitely not for submerging. So weatherproofing in camera lenses is definitely lacking in its performance or in its quality. Lens interchangeability, we just spoke about it, so we need to be really careful about flange focal distance. That's kind of the primary factor. Again, if we can overcome the obstacle of the physical mount or the physical difference in mount. And again, by far the most important factor in adaptation is the flange focal distance. So the flange focal distance should be longer in the camera than in the lens, or the same lens. So in other words, if you're using a lens that was engineered for a camera with a short flange focal distance on a camera with a longer flange focal distance, so if you're trying to put a lens made for a mirrorless camera on a SLR, it might not work. Chances are it's not going to work. So you can correct that with an optical adapter. Some adapters have electronics, some not. They're called cold and hot adapters. Again, if you use a cold adapter with with an autofocus lens, you are going to lose the autofocus functionality, and you'll have to focus manually, not from the camera. And similarly, there are adapters with optics in them, so optics that can compensate for the discrepancy in flange focal distance. If the flange focal distance is too short, then there are adapters that can compensate for it, but just understand that most probably there will be some degradation in image quality. So this is the idea of adapters. Called just physical mating. It goes from one system to another system A to system B, or vice versa, Nikon to Canon to Sony to Nikon, whichever way you want. There are a lot of adapters out there. They do not cover every single imaginable scenario, but they do cover a lot. So for the big brands, definitely. But again, the one thing that we have to be most aware of is the flange focal distance, and to some extent the medium or the sensor coverage. Now, of course, we're talking here about image formation, which is the big challenge of a camera lens. And for those of you who watched the introductions to these series, I spoke about a hypothetical assignment for a student to go and recreate a three-dimensional scene, just pretty much what you would just see in front of your eyes on a two-dimensional plane. And the example I used is that they told him to use a mosaic. So they gave him a crate full of tiny little squares, let's just say 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch, with a glue, and he has to glue point for point, recreate the scene. Now when we do this from a three-dimensional scene, we have a problem, because the reality is three-dimensional, then we have to omit certain things or distort them, and that is the problem that we have with image formation on a flat and very large medium, such as a sensor or a film. And this is how it works. And if you look at where it says focal plane, the red circle or oval, in a human eye, that's a tiny point, but in the camera that would be a much wider area. So it would be more correct for this diagram to show the image not exactly where the lines converge. Again, they have to be converging there because it has to be focused, but for the sake of demonstration, they have to repeat this many times. So let's just say advance that red oval a little bit to the left, so toward the big lens, to show you, just to exemplify what a problem we have here. And again, now we're going to go into focal length, and that is the primary topic. Let's just say when someone is thinking about lenses, or someone is thinking about purchasing a lens, the first thing that comes to mind is focal length. Again, in the end, I will mention something that is more important and supersedes everything, including the focal length. But the way that focal length replicates the image, the reality on the sensor, it does make a big difference. So typically, the shorter the focal length, the bigger, the wider the angle is, the angle of view, the field of view. So that is really what we're looking at. We're looking at the field of view that is available to photograph, and that is the primary descriptor of the focal length. It's somewhat of a misnomer. Focal length is really the actual distance between the entrance pupil, where the light hits the first element. Let's just say, simplify this, until the point where the light exits, in other words, forms an image on the medium. But the focal length has some other influence also on how the final image is going to be replicated or formed on the medium. And again, this will be expanded on a little bit longer. So again, like I said, in practice, we're talking about the angle of view. A lens with, let's just say, a very wide or relatively wide angle of view, 28mm, will be able to capture a wider scene in front of the photographer, whereas one with a very long focal length, something like 200, 300, is concentrates on a smaller point in the distance, so it will be a much narrower. But again, longer focal length also have shorter distance uses or applications, like in macro, for example. So if you wanna get really up close to something, like something very small, like a bee on a flower or things of that nature, then the longer focal length can be helpful. And here we see real life examples. This is the same scene photographed with the same camera with a similar lens. I imagine that they used a zoom lens here, and so the photographer was standing in the same spot and just extending the zoom and snapping one photo after another. You can see that the 18mm is very wide. It takes in a lot of the scene, and now as we advance we can see less and less of the scene, but conversely we have the appearance or the illusion of the image being magnified. Again, that's a whole other topic, what is considered magnification and how we quantify it. But again, in photography we're not talking about magnification. In binoculars the topic is typically magnification, because you can see the scene 10 times as big as it appears with the unaided eye. So that's kind of like a real easy and simple metric. With a camera lens, what happens is that the image is going to be replicated on a certain size medium, and then from the medium it's going to go somewhere else. In the past we used to print photographs on a 4x6 or 5x7 card, stiff paper, right, photography paper. Today we share it all over the place. It can go on a smartphone or the screen of a computer, and of course there are myriads and myriads of screen sizes, and one can enlarge it on the screen. So it's a slightly different dynamic, and we don't talk in terms of magnification, but it's not like this term doesn't exist or totally doesn't exist. So in photography, but it means something slightly different. But anyway, this is what the correlation of angle and focal length is. So as you can see, the very far focal length, the one that's kind of in pink, that is I can't even read what this is, a 900mm, and then it shows you an angular and a distance denomination or size. So the one prior to the 600mm shows you an angle of 4 degrees and 10 feet, and of course that has to be defined at what distance from the camera. So this assumes a certain distance from the camera. And the first one I said 3 feet, which is not true. It's 3 degrees. But as you can see, as we decrease the focal length, the angle of viewing is wide, and sometimes it can be too wide. So the last one is a fisheye lens, which is a huge angle, and that will distort the image no matter what. A slightly longer focal length, such as the 15mm, which is also sometimes used like in a very distant landscape, that could look good. But if you would try to photograph someone's face from relatively close up, it would smear out. It would make him like a flattened nose, and it just wouldn't look natural. And typically towards the middle, so 35 to 50 is what we call quote-unquote natural lenses. So each lens has its looks and its own function, and this is how it works on the camera. So as you can see, the more we shorten the distance between the entrance pupil, let's just say, or the optical center, and the distance where the image is projected, meaning the medium distance, that's a similar idea to the flange focal length, not flange focal distance. Not exactly the same, but a similar concept. So as you can see, if we shorten that distance, the angle will widen, and vice versa. If we lengthen that distance, the angle will recede. We talk a lot about lens compression, and there is no such thing as lens compression. So the first thing you should do before you even learn this term is forget it. But what photographers refer to is how a lens renders or recreates the background. So in other words, let's take an example that you want to take a photograph. So a simple example would be taking a portrait, a standing portrait of an individual, and in front of a, let's just say, a back porch or backyard, okay? And you want the image to be as close as possible, so let's just say identical, with different focal lengths. And let's just start with a shorter focal length. So let's just say that we're going to go from 28, which is pretty wide, to something like 50 to 100. So I think 3 steps is a good example. So with a 28 millimeter, I want to make the image to look a certain way. So I stand up, hey Johnny, stand here, and let's imagine, for the sake of purpose, that I'm taking a horizontally oriented image, and I want Johnny to take up most of the space from top to bottom. So I stand him down, and I'm gonna straighten out my frame with the bottom of the porch, and he's standing there, and behind him there's all the crap that you would usually expect on a porch: some tables, chairs, a barbecue, some plants, what have you. Now, in order to accomplish this, in other words, to have consistently equal distance between his head and the end of the frame, and his feet and the end of the frame, and from his shoulders to the end of the frame, I have to go to be a certain distance from him. So I'm away, and we said that we're going to start with the 100 millimeter. So I orient myself, or I place myself in front of him until I achieve the desired result. Okay, so now it looks a certain way. I take the frame, and now I switch lenses. I put on the whatever lens that we mentioned before, the 55 millimeter. So now I see the same thing, but through the camera the scene looks a little bit different. He is smaller, so he takes much less space. So I start advancing towards him so that he should have, again, the same amount of space between his shoulder and the left and right edges of the frame, and between his head and his feet and the bottom and the top of the frame. Okay, so now it's the same frame, but after I take the image, the background will look different, because again, the angle always goes out. So when I accomplish this the first time, yes, on that exact plane where he is standing, it will look the same, but the background will look the same. And again, the same thing will repeat itself with a 28 millimeter lens. So I will go even closer to him, and chances are that at this point, even on the subject's plane, you will be able, if you look good, you will be able to discern differences. So his face is going to look a little bit distorted, or maybe unnatural, not exactly. Again, that of course differs. Maybe from this distance, a full body portrait, you might not, if you don't have a lot of experience. But the background will definitely change. So you will see that there's more of the background, even though he didn't change his position, but the lens will capture more of the background, and that creates a certain effect. So let's just say that if we would put the person on a completely neutral background, we somehow position him that we see nothing but the clear blue sky, or a flat wall painted exactly in the same color, it would make no difference. So again, there's no such thing as lens compression, despite the fact that there's a ton and ton of talk about it. But they just mean that you could recreate the same image with different focal lengths, but still get slightly different results, based especially on the background. So this is just to exemplify the fact that the focal length is not only a matter of angle. Well, it is a matter of angle, but it will respond differently to different scenarios. Okay. Also, the longer the focal length, the shallower the focus depth will be, and I'll come back to this concept, and that also works in conjunction with the aperture. So super important. When we say aperture in photography, we mean this little mechanism in the middle. Can we see this? Here we go. You can see here, let's put my hand here and reflect some light, and you can see that as I open this, let me hold it proper, here we go. Now the aperture becomes smaller. This is the smallest aperture. And now I turn this, and it's bigger, and you can see that it looks like a hexagon, because this aperture is built with 6 blades, and very often now this is completely open. This is aperture 2.0, and this is considered relatively fast. Of course, modern cameras made it a little bit more affordable to go with apertures as big as 1.4, sometimes even 1.2, but again, these are still rare, and if it does get to that, it gets pretty expensive. But as you can see here, this is a smooth circle, so you don't see the mechanical aperture, and at least in theory this can render a prettier, more beautiful image. But again, the counter argument to this is that the lens is sharpest towards its middle. So if we go with a smaller aperture, let's just say an 11 or even an 8, even though we might get more diffraction, and I'll go into that in a second, but we're using mostly the center part of the frame, so we can have a nicer or more precise or more beautiful optical performance. So as you can see, everything has a price. Now, I mentioned diffraction, and that means that when you look through here, there is some light that bounces off the edges of the blade. So the thinner the blade, and sometimes the material that the blade is made of, and the coating, meaning the coloring on it, and even the finish of that angle, if the blade is a little bit rounded, as you can imagine, this is fairly precise and complicated manufacturing, so all of these factors in the price. But again, it reduces diffraction, and of course, by the time that all the engineers came up with a new idea and marketed a new lens which reduces diffraction, all of a sudden diffraction becomes fashionable again. And the whole program goes to crap. But yeah, unfortunately that's like this. Now photographers make a big deal out of bokeh, and everybody has to take all of their pictures with the background blurred, and there is a method to do that. But anyway, case in point is that we don't have to mindlessly follow trends and fashions, and just because everybody does it. So okay, there is a place for blurring the background, but you don't have to concentrate 90% of your photography on bokeh, maybe 1%. But okay, I'm gonna go unfortunately on such rants here. But again, the topic here today is not photography, but lenses per se. So I'll try to stay on topic as much as I can. What we need to know is that modern lenses may omit the aperture control, the manual aperture control, because it can be controlled from on board the camera digitally, and there isn't a need for it. But for those of us who use manual cameras, non-electronic, non-digital cameras, this is a big advantage. So we have to have aperture control, because if we put this on an old analog or manual camera, even if it's not analog, I don't know if this is such thing. There might just be, or let's just say that we use a certain lens with a cold adapter. So we have to make sure that we do have an aperture ring, because if the camera cannot talk to the lens, there's a CPU and a servo motor that regulates the focus, the aperture, and in case of a zoom lens, the zoom of the lens. So that's why before purchasing a lens, we have to know what we're going to use it on, and if we are lacking one of these controls, we have to know that we would have to use it with a system that is only suitable for a system that allows for onboard control. Okay, so now we mentioned the aperture shortly. We're going to go in it a little bit deeper, but now that we have a basic understanding of focal length and aperture, let's go into prime versus zoom. It simply means this is a prime lens, so this is 50 millimeter focal length. It will always stay that way unless someone takes it apart and rebuilds and re-engineers it. This one is a zoom. Like I showed you before, it can go from 28 to 70 millimeters. And as you can see, zoom lenses very often will have an external part of the body extend at the shorter focal distances, and this one does so even with the focusing. You see, this is a separate control. It's nothing to do with the focal length, what it does, because that's how you focus. But let's pretend right now that it doesn't happen that way. It does something else also, so there's another element moving in there. And as you can see, this focus control doesn't have a lot of meat to grab on. It's just this really thin area, and I think that there is a plastic grabber missing on here, but I'm not 100% sure. And be it as it may, this was conceived as an autofocus lens, so they didn't really think of old geezers like myself who would insist on manually focusing the lens, whether this is attached to a digital or analog camera. But anyway, so this is one of the big distinctions in lenses, in classifying lenses, prime versus zoom. The fans of prime will swear to you that a prime lens has a higher quality of a zoom lens, and they might be right, but it's mostly in the word of Alice in Wonderland. So I would say that in probably 90 or at least 80% of scenarios, the prime lens does not offer any tangible advantage over a zoom lens. Again, talking quality level to quality level. Of course, a zoom lens will cost you more, but if you buy something, and let's just say a 50mm lens from a certain brand and a certain product line, and you buy their zoom that goes from, let's just say like this, from 28 to 70, you will not really see a difference in quality. In fact, a lot of people online have made these comparisons, and there was no two tiny little differences. However, if you stress the system, if you strain the system, and again, that strain is of course not necessarily or not usually in real time, not at the level of the user, but at the level of engineering and designing the lens, it puts a lot of strain on the optical system. And of course, everything that you do to such a system will come at the expense of something else. So let's just say that we're going to very wide. Let's just say a fisheye that goes fisheye. I just said that would be a 12mm or something like that. 10mm lens. Let's just say it's super extreme. I'll just say with 12. 10 is not realistic, but a 12mm lens that goes to 3 times, which is pretty typical. So goes from 12 to 36. Besides for the limited application, it puts a very big optical strain, and then if you compare that to a prime within that range, then you might see a degradation. And of course, optical quality versus the prime would suffer. Or if you strain the system, for example, the zoom ratio, normal camera lenses, the zoom ratio is somewhere between 2:1 and 3:1, so a 50 to 100, or a 28 to a 70, something like that, 28 to 85. That's when it's within this realm, it is good. When you start straining the system, when you make a 4:1 or maybe even a 5:1, 50 to 250, then of course the quality will suffer, and as you would expect, of course, around the edges. So that's the story with primes and zooms. Again, the vast majority of the market today uses zoom lenses, and they are good, but the big manufacturers, the big fancy names, they are still for the most part concentrating on producing prime lenses. So photographers who have a lot of respect for themselves and they have some exacting or specific work, they may prefer to work with prime lenses. But from a practicality perspective, and especially when you don't buy in the very expensive realm of lenses, when you don't spend thousands of dollars, then of course it becomes less and less relevant. So now that we've covered most of the focal length issues, let's talk about apertures. And the aperture in and of itself, like I said, is denoted in numbers like 2, which is very common to start with 2, and many lenses will start below 2, so 2.8 or 3.2, something in that neighborhood. Lenses that start with, I just say, usually 2.8 or 2 will be considered fast lenses, because you can allow in a lot of light into the system to use faster speeds, faster shutter speeds. So the shutter speed is the amount of time that the shutter stays open, and they're denoted in fractions of a second. So 2000 means 1/2000 of a second. That means that the shutter is open for a very, very short period, and then it goes to 1000, so 1,500, 250, 125, and so on. The exposure value is a system wherein there are corresponding aperture sizes and shutter speeds. And for the moment, we will make abstraction of the ISO. So the ISO is an extra complication thrown into the system. But let's just say that for a certain scene, we have, or we want to take it at a certain amount of light. So allow a certain amount of light into the system. So now, as you can see, my aperture is on number 4. And I look up my light meter. I understand that in order to properly expose this scene, I have to use 1/500 of a second. Now I say, you know what, for one reason or another, I want to use a faster speed, or vice versa. I'm interested in just having it all the way open, to have that beautiful circle, and to open wide open, or maybe to thin out the depth of field. So I open this all the way, and in order to compensate for that, I would have to increase, in other words, decrease the opening of the shutter speed, the time slot that the shutter speed is open, from 500 to 2000. Okay, so I let in 2 times twice as much light into the system as possible. Now I have to compensate for it and open and close the shutter very, very fast. If I go the opposite direction, I go from 4 to 5.6 or even 8, now I have to do the opposite. I have to go down to 250 or 125. And of course, again, without touching the ISO. Now, with digital cameras, you can just bump the ISO up and down, and so you have a lot of room to regulate this, or to play with this from one frame to another. But in a film camera, you put in a certain film, a 400 or a 100 ISO film, and until you expose all of the frames available in that roll, you are stuck, or you are locked into using only the aperture and the shutter speed, which in and of themselves are usually enough. And the f-stop also has quite some influence on the depth of field. Depth of field is how much of the scene in front of us on the z-coordinate. So the x-coordinate would be the vertical, the up and down. The y-coordinate is left to right, the horizontal, and the z-coordinate is between you and me as conversants, or between you and the subject. So when we focus on something, let's just say that there's a little tree in front of me and I want to focus it, I adjust the focus to bring the tree in focus, but a little bit of the scene in front of it and a little bit of the scene behind it will also be in focus. So this is a function of a couple things, but in practice that will be a function of the focal length and the aperture opening. So the wider the aperture and the longer the focal length, then the shallower the distance, the focus depth. So you would have to focus more precisely if you want to be on something. And again, like I said, it's very fashionable now to blur out the background. So the more you want to blur the background, the bigger the aperture you need to use. So assuming a zoom system, the shallowest depth of field that you would get is when the zoom is at its longest focal length setting and the aperture is open wide. Again, you don't always have to do this, and you don't always have the opportunity to do this. So depending on how far you are from the subject, you may not get, you would have to be locked into a certain focal length. So let's just say that for one reason or another, you cannot move too much, and so you have to use a certain focal length. And then if, let's just say, your ISO is limited, you have a film and your camera is older, so it only goes up to 1/1000th of a second, you might not be able to use the aperture opening that you want. But again, typically, if you're looking at a normal subject, you would be able to focus on it properly. And again, playing with the other parameters is not entirely crucial. So with the modern camera, of course, affords you much more flexibility regarding all of these details. Now, what does the f-stop really mean? The f-stop means the difference, the ratio of the focal length by the aperture. So in other words, the focal length divided by the opening of the aperture equals 2. So it's a divider, it's always the same. That's why it doesn't matter what focal length and what size of the lens is. But when you use a faster lens, so let's just say that you would use a 50mm lens that instead of 2.0 would have a maximum aperture size of 1.2, which is gigantic and not very common. But the lens itself would have to be much bigger because it would have to land in light, and this of course pertains to the area, and therefore we're talking about the power of 2. So in other words, square and square roots. So that's why the actual mathematical formula involves square roots, and that's why they advance in such funky increments. And again, whoever is more interested in the actual mathematical formula is welcome to look it up. And again, I expanded on that a little bit in the introductory videos. Again, focus depth and distance. The focus is when we are able to form an image in its simplest definition, and typically this implies that it's a well-formed image, an image that's not just recognizable, but it's nice and beautiful and sharp enough. So if we're talking about, let's just say, an individual, you start focusing. Let's just say that your system is set at the close focus and he stands at a certain distance from us. We start focusing, we still don't see it, it's just a complete blur. Then we slowly start to come into shape. We can see that there's a human being here, an individual, and then we can finally identify him. So for all intents and purposes, approximately the level of focus where you can identify a human being is considered good enough. Of course, for photograph you would demand much more. You want sharpness, and I just spoke about focus depth, is how much of the scene in front of us is in focus. And in camera lenses, fairly often the depth of focus is somewhat thinner than in normal optics. Again, in normal optics, it depends a lot, of course, on the speed of the system, of which we don't typically talk about in binoculars, and the magnification. So a 10x binocular would have a more shallow field than an 8x, for example, and of course so on and so forth. So a 12x will even have a more shallower field. But in sport optics, we're typically interested in widening, in using the widest possible depth of field, because we don't want to refocus all the time. In photograph, we take a specific photograph, we want it to look a certain way, so sometimes a thinner depth of field is wanted, is being desired, and sometimes we just have to because we need to let in enough light. So that the focus depth has kind of a good influence, or has to be taken in account in photography. And here this is an example of the focus depth. So it's relatively shallow. You can see that the flower in the middle is in very sharp focus, but the blade of grass that are closer to us or farther away from us are quite blurred. out. So that's what we mean by depth of focus. And here is another side-by-side comparison. So the image on the left-hand side where it says large or deep depth of field or depth of focus, it's all the same. Then we have a smaller aperture and a slower exposure time or slower shutter speed, whereas on the right-hand side, where we see the shallow depth of field, then that means that the photographer opened the aperture to a bigger opening, and of course exposed for a shorter time. Again, focusing on most modern cameras, that happens on board of the camera, and many cameras offer, besides for the autofocus, a sort of a manual, like a manual in quote marks, or virtual manual focusing, so that you can continuously focus in and out from on board the camera. Not all cameras offer that feature, and sometimes you can use the autofocus feature a little bit to do that. So if it has a screen, a touch screen that allows you to drag the exact focus point to where you want, you may be able to play with it. But the vast majority of lenses, even to this day, would offer a focusing ring, with some exceptions, probably. Okay, now that we have a fairly good understanding of focus and aperture and the structure and the function of the camera, now we're getting into the meat and potatoes. So MTF, modulation transfer function. This kind of sounds all scientific and fancy, but it's not entirely necessary. So this is a formula, or a protocol rather, that attempts to gauge not even the quality, they don't even express its quality, but the performance of the lens. Again, performance is a borrowed term because the lens is a passive instrument for the most part. It lets light through it, so it doesn't perform, but we call it performance. But we have to know that this is not an entirely truthful descriptor or word. Anyway, what the MTF does is it gauges the contrast and resolution. So in optics, in practical optics that involve human beings having to see something, contrast and resolution are the two big quantifiable details or quantifiable aspects of the view or of the photograph. And contrast relates mostly to intensity and color. So how well different colors and different shades can be distinguished from one another. And resolution is the recognition of shapes. So when there is something super obvious and super evident, such as a black square on a white background, or vice versa, a white square on a black background, it's very obvious, and that's where all the mathematical gauging happens and comes into place. And again, in modern charts, there are of course much more complexity thrown in there. There are circles with alternating white and black slices going from the middle, and the level of whiteness and blackness, so there's a grayscale. But anyway, the scientific measurement cannot truly determine what a human being considers quality or beautiful, because typically the scene in us is way more complex. It involves different shapes and different colors and different light intensities. But be it as it may, the industry considers MTF as a relatively reliable or at least popular or common way of gauging the quality or like I said, the performance of the lens. So if we look at the chart here,
the horizontal axis that goes from 369 and on denotes the distance from the center of the lens. So 0 is the dead center of the lens, and on the vertical axis, if we look at it from top to bottom, we see 1, then 0.9, 0.8, and so on, and that denotes the amount of throughput, roughly, so the percentage. Now, of course, we know that it can never be 100% because the glass in and of itself would absorb and also reflect a little bit of the light. So it can never be 100%, and of course, in some way, this is also one of the aspects or the qualities that we are evaluating, how much the instrument, in this case the camera lens, can put through. And we can see a number of things. Look at the insert. In the insert there are two diagrams, or two sets of diagrams, one with denser spaced lines than the other. So as we explained in the introductory videos when we spoke about contrast and resolution, the density of those lines, of those pairs of black and white lines, you can imagine it as black and white, makes it more difficult to resolve and to understand the contrast. Now, as we spoke there, contrast and resolution are not ever completely independent of one another, but be it as it may, the less dense, the 10 lines per millimeter attempts to gauge more the contrast, and the denser lines, the 30 line pairs per millimeter, are attempting to gauge a little bit more the resolution quality of the lens. So as you can see, on top we have the red lines, which is attempting a little bit more, like I said, to gauge the contrast, and we can understand a few things from the chart. Number one, when we are trying to resolve the denser lines, it's more difficult because you can see it's lower on the percentage scale, and also, of course, as we going away, we increase the distance from the center, then the quality always descends. And the other thing is that the divergence between the same color lines also increases as we go away from the lens. So we evaluate the same thing but on two dimensions. You can see the sagittal and meridional lines, or you can just think of it as horizontal and vertical, but there are two dimensions or two directions that be engaged, and although they are close, they start diverging, and of course the divergence increases as we go away from the center of the lens. So this is more or less a relatively well accepted method of evaluating or gauging the performance of the instrument.
Now, there are several, I don't want to say problems, but inaccuracies. So you cannot truly rely on a chart like this for several reasons. Number one, the method or the protocol to gauge the MTF is not standardized. In other words, every company can make up its own MTF protocol. Of course, there are basics that everyone does follow because it's an industry practice, but the exact little details which can make a difference are not standardized and are not also published. So they tell you quite a list of details. Again, the higher the quality of the lens, the more details they will publish, because they want to show that this is that this is a reliable metric. But in reality, they won't tell you exactly what kind of light, how much light, from what distance, from what wavelength they projected, how much was the throughput. So they don't give you the entire result of the entire list. They give you a simplified chart, and some give you a little bit more complicated, more detailed charts. But case in point is that this is really only reliable within one brand, and even within one brand, I would really rely on it only within one product line, because the more affordable product line that has less quality, the company typically will not want to disclose its weaknesses, right? So they may change the protocol a little bit. And again, it's not necessarily cheating, not necessarily dishonesty, but a lens of that nature may require a slightly different way of testing. But the main idea is that you cannot take two very different lenses, from different manufacturers of widely differing focal lengths, and compare the charts. So really, you want to compare the lens itself. And again, when comparing lenses, just like in all other optics, you want to be like to like. You want to compare. You want to isolate a certain variable as much as possible. So if you want to see whether you know already that you want a certain focal length. Let's just say that you're shopping for a 35 millimeter, then you're considering different brands. Well, you would have to go within the same price range more or less. So you cannot compare a high quality brand to a low quality brand, to an expensive lens to a cheap lens, and vice versa. Conversely, if you're looking to compare how different focal length or different lenses with some other details would compare to one another, you want to isolate, you want to make them as similar as possible. So check from the same manufacturer, if possible from within the same product line or across product lines in the same focal length, and so on and so forth. Again, lens quality, just like other optics, 3 factors: optical quality, mechanical quality, structural quality. These are the things that you're looking for. Mechanical and structural quality are relatively easy to gauge because they're really physical. So the structural quality is how well it is built, how strong it is, how shockproof, fall-proof, weatherproofing, all of these. Okay, you can't really see it on the camera, but you can gauge it pretty reliably. Same thing with the focus. Is the focus precise? If the focus throw is good for you? Do you like it? Do you like the way it feels? Is it smooth enough? Is there enough resistance, and so on and so forth? Same thing with the aperture ring. And if you have a zoom, if you're looking at a zoom camera, then same thing with the zoom system. So these are relatively easy to gauge. Again, there are a lot of unknowns, so you have to read reviews and especially customer reviews, how long it will last. But this is kind of the easiest part, or the easier part. Optically, ultimately, all the technical mumbo jumbo, the MTF, and all of this really boils down to the individual, and you have to have the knowledge and the experience to understand differences between lenses. So experienced photographers can talk for hours and hours about the minute differences between 2 quasi-identical lenses. If you're not there, you don't have to delve in it. You just have to look at images and try to gauge what you like and dislike, right? Photographers talk in terms of rendering, sharpness, contrast, skin tones, things of that nature. So that's really that's where really you have to focus. So the true optical quality, and then your relation or your liking to that lens. And another thing, if I may, I like preaching sometimes, is think about it this way. At the end of the day, your gear is just it's physical gear, and I think that in the realm of photography, more than all other optics, there is a very strong, and in my opinion fairly idiotic, adherence to brands. Now again, partially this is the nature of the beast, because again, you have one brand of camera, so they force you to buy their brand of lens. And that's why I would very, very strongly recommend, if someone is just thinking about going into photography or just purchasing their first gear, always go with the lens first. So the lens is the heart and the soul of the equipment, but at the end of the day, it's really equipment. And no amount of quality and gizmos and features will make you a better photographer. So this is something, the equipment is really secondary. So being a photographer is just your learning and practicing and getting better and better. And you can do very, very well with super simple gear, super simple cameras. Again, if someone doesn't have any gear, I would just recommend them to start with a smartphone, because modern smartphones have incredible quality, and you can take very, very good images, and it's advisable, in my opinion, to save your money until you're really, really sure that you want to go into photography and that you want to do that with passion, because the industry is kind of dying. The entire maybe not the photography industry per se was also very impacted, but the camera industry is dying. There's less and less rational reason to own cameras. But again, to exemplify the case in point, is that my system, I don't have it right here, but I typically use a camera that you can get on eBay for $20 to $30, and the lens that, well, in its time it was sold for $2,000 when it was new. Today you can find it used for about half the price, but even so, $1,000 lens on a $20 camera is not a stupid idea, because I only need the camera to be a black box and save the film until I develop it. So that's what it is. Don't fall in love with your gear. Certainly don't fall in love with any kind of brand. They're all bastards. They all just want to make money. And I would very strongly recommend to consider primarily the lens quality. Of course, there are other factors. So this brand that I have, part of the reason that I have it is because across the years and across the generations and versions of all their lenses, they're all back compatible with the old cameras. So that's very good. So I have a longer period, whereas most other brands, they make changes, or the brand itself is newer, and so there's less of a pool of available lenses. And here, these lenses, they are so good and so cheap that it doesn't really make any sense, for me at least, to go with a different brand. The big competing brand also has tons and tons of lenses, but at least in principle, there are more lenses from this brand that are available through the year, and so there's more older lenses, and they're all pretty good. So I hope that I covered the camera lens saga satisfactorily. Of course, if you have any other questions, please put them in the bottom, so there will be opportunity to do more things, to go into specific topics. Just let me know what you want, and put it in the comment, and I'll try to accommodate and make some other videos into them. And in the meantime, keep your equipment in good shape and enjoy the great outdoors as much as possible and as responsibly as possible. Have a good one.